This edition of Art Beat originates from the studio of Nelson Shanks in Andalusia, Pennsylvania. The Central Bucks Chamber of Commerce has just named Mr. Shanks as the recipient for the 1990 Lifetime Achievement Award in the Arts. The Chamber's award program is exclusive to Bucks County. Each honoree embraces the highest degree of achievement and selfless love of mankind. Nelson Shanks' professional standing is unsurpassed in the distinctive culture of classical portraiture, as well as in teaching. It has been said that his works are among the great assets of Philadelphia. Mr. Shanks' work has been exhibited in many museums and galleries, and a major retrospective of his work is planned for exhibition in London and in Italy in 1992. Today we interview Nelson as he paints the portrait of Peter Sampson, who is president of the University of the Arts in Philadelphia.
I'm not sure. I like this idea of just rather tense, because I'm trying to do a calm face and a tense hand. Not real tense. Let me see the side of the hand more than the... That's it. There you go. Okay, now drop it, Peter, at the wrist. Not a lot. Hold it.
Well, portraiture has always been a vital part of the history of art throughout the centuries. Only in recent years, sort of since World War II, that it's been neglected. And many serious painters have not done portraiture. But now it's beginning to come back, and with an outstanding artist like Nelson doing it, I think that gives it a validity. And Nelson and his students have made a real contribution to bringing back portraiture as a serious art form. Well, one of the things we like to do at the University of the Arts is bring in outstanding artists as visiting lecturers, and we are particularly pleased to have Nelson do a painting class, because that shows to the students what a great artist does and how he does it, and adds to our regular curriculum.
When I was, I guess, 2, 3, I was drawing a great deal. And by the time I was 5, my father had gotten an oil painting, quote, kit, so that when he was on leave from the Navy, he would have something to do at home. And before he got a chance to get home, I used it up. So I was doing oil paintings when I was 5. And oddly enough, as I look back at some of those early things, I was very interested in light and shadow. I would do paintings of buildings with shadows. And obviously they were somewhat childish, but a little different than you might expect ordinarily. And I just continued drawing things and painting things I liked, which was specifically horses back then. And by the time I suppose I was 7 or 8, people started leading the horses or appearing in pictures. And by the time I was about 13 or 14, why the horses disappeared and the people remained. I had studied with very strong colorists, and whose drawing was rather weak. And so I thought that I was always a great admirer of the great draftsmen, and I felt that it was very important to learn to draw with the sureness that a great colorist could apply color. So most of my career has been trying to put the two together in a way that is different, unusual, and makes consummate sense to me. And so in that sense, I think hopefully someone will look at my paintings and realize that the color is not the same. It's not a formula that where things are just repeated over and over and over. I try to perceive color and put shapes and masses of color together in a way that most people do not. Most realists draw and then fill it in with color. I develop a painting as areas of color that start taking shape and then take further shape and ultimately refinement, and then hopefully ultimately great refinement as a result of shifting colors. I think it's more congruous and compatible with the way one sees a drawing and then filling it in with color. And the approach is equally valid and facilitates painting virtually any subject. Anything you see that way, you can paint. So many painters, especially those who do portraits and figures, will have 3 or 4 little tints of flesh color, and that's what they paint with. And it's severely limiting, because if you paint an Oriental in sunlight, obviously it's going to be different than a Caucasian indoors in a studio. And if you only know one little formula with one little batter mixed up, why, obviously you're severely limited. It's like playing 1 octave on a piano when you have all these other options. So this has a great deal to do with the way I teach. And it develops into a philosophy about learning to see and learning to organize both thought processes having to do with this and other things. And this all has to do more with technique, of course, than perhaps artistic point of view. It has more to do with the mechanics of painting, perhaps. But it becomes in itself an aesthetic, and that's what painting is, in a sense. It sort of melts from technique, ways of seeing, philosophies of seeing, interpretations of life in that sense, and in a perhaps more subjective, less objective sense. So this is all something that comes to students, and we discuss a great deal too, especially as they advance. When I was asked to teach at the University of the Arts, they scheduled of course it was a one-man show, and then they arranged for me to do a lecture demonstration one evening. I think they had about 150 people there, 200. And that was a demonstration done in roughly 2.5 painting hours, just to show them the principle of what I had discussed before, the way I paint, see. It was simply done under an artificial light in the middle of a little arena of people. And it's probably roughly 2.5 painting hours. This is what art is really all about. I think while certain artists have tried to intellectualize it, and possibly even on the level that it could be put on a computer slide rule or whatever, and I think of Poussin that way sometimes. I think that the real basic function is gut level reaction. And this has a lot, all these things have a great deal to do, of course, with time, the time. What was going on in Vienna in 1912 it was obviously expected to be considerably different than what was going on in France in 1812. So an art historian, or at least someone who has a deep interest in this, should have an idea of what's going on elsewhere. But then you have, of course, not that I want to get into an art history lecture, but I'm probably not even qualified, but an artist can be a product of his time, or an artist can be extraneous from his time, but then on retrospect perhaps be considered beyond his time, in advance of his time. And it's really rather interesting that there was a very strong belief that certain neo-movements, for example, David, coming across with neoclassicism, it's fascinating to realize was considered to be in advance of his time. Not a reactionary, but rather neoclassicism. The entire Renaissance movement simply, of course, means rebirth. Anyone knows that. Rebirth of what? Rebirth of Greek classical art. That's basically what it was. The great bronze sculptors, for example, the great sculptors. Even Michelangelo was, perhaps more than anyone, inspired by, and probably his major notion, his major idea was to aspire to the greatness of the Greek Hellenistic sculptors. I like to think that art can be uplifting. that isn't its only function. I find myself, for example, getting more and more excited and interested in the idea of using metaphors in painting and going back to classical ideals.
I asked Nelson if he had any problems when painting ex-President Reagan.
Well, the biggest problem with the painting of Mr. Reagan, not that there were any enormous problems, but the difficulty was his staff is so terribly protective that when we left for California, we thought that we might be fortunate to have a few hours with him. And so the staff was allocating time with him, at an hour or two at a time. So I didn't know exactly how much time I would have, and I couldn't prepare or start something knowing that I would have a certain amount of time to work on it. I couldn't pre-plan. So I just did sketch after sketch, oil sketch after oil sketch, and none of which were the finished painting or even part of the finished painting. So in a way, the net result was, while we had, I think, 15, 17 hours with the president, and he was unbelievably willing and cooperative and helpful and nice. It would have been a lot easier if I'd known in advance what I had to deal with. Another difficulty with him, of course, is that he has one of the most mobile faces I think I've ever confronted. And most people in sitting will sort of reach a sort of status quo of expression. And Mr. Reagan would go from sort of left field to right field, not in movement, but just in facial expression. And he sits and thinks up things to say, and you can see his face sort of get very serious, and then you see him start to light up, and then he sparkles, and then he looks up at you and projects, and waits for a reaction. Well, unfortunately, I was concentrating so hard, he would go through the entire process, look up, wait for a reaction, and I'd be there totally blank, painting away just intensely. And he would say, "Nelson, you didn't get that. You didn't understand that." And I couldn't lie, so I said, "Well, I am afraid I didn't, Mr. President." And so we'd start over again, and I'd clutch, and I'd be concentrating, and I wouldn't get it the second time, and finally he was so frustrated. But he was a most enjoyable man. It's a problem, you know, how do you paint an icon? I mean, this is the most famous man in the world. Being in front of him, he's just a remarkably human, warm person. The next one, which you'll see, that's still here in the studio and not quite finished, he's projecting, both with his body, a forward kind of movement. The arm is forward. The Renaissance, or not the Renaissance, but the Remington bronze is in it, which gives another side. It shows it's a sort of symbol of the tumultuous office, and also alludes to his love of the West. And he's smiling, which people expect from Mr. Reagan, walking forward out of the canvas. Well, that's a painting of the three men of the family, the father on the right and the two sons in their early 20s. They're a family from New York, absolutely delightful, low-key family, very close and caring of one another. And I painted the mother about 2 years ago in New York City, and they liked that enough that they wanted me to paint the other three. And so this is what I came up with, composition. I tried to do something that was dramatic. I couldn't do something that was too far out. The idea here with the clothing, of course, is that they do a lot of hunting together. This is one of their family projects, and so I didn't want to make a big deal out of guns all over the thing and what have you, but more the feeling of, if not a hunting lodge, then at least something of that level, let's say. I didn't want to paint them in a formal interior with business suits. It just wouldn't be them. And so I think that there was something unique about each one of them that is captured here. I have the entire painting to develop, the sofa, a lot of the textures, certainly the background to develop. I was concentrating more on the way the three of them worked in the space of the canvas. And now I'll make decisions about what to do with the rest of it, how to develop the space between them, going back some distance in the middle. I'll probably put a still life on the lower right, which will reiterate the planes and the shadows and the depth that his shadow, the father's shadow, creates on the right on the screen, and a still life on a table down below. Again, something that's compatible with the painting will give another dimension. And I have probably another week or 10 days to work on the picture to develop all that. One of my favorite paintings is that nude of Christina, who is a or rather a Pennsylvania Academy student who did some posing, and you know, Wesselman and various other American artists have done what they call the Great American Nude. That's more my idea of it than the Marilyn Monroe type that they pick up on. But I like that painting because there's a kind of an awe at spirituality. It's as though she were someone who is, and I suspect she is, someone who, like any young aspiring artist, should we say, in awe of the spiritual aspect of things, in awe of perhaps what is to come in her life, potential, all this self-examination, hopefully with a thinking of the exciting prospects for development of herself and one thing and another, and yet the total exposure of nudity, and I think that's kind of an interesting subject. There's a nude, two nudes lit by artificial light from below, which are rather complicated, and there's a, depending on the direction of the light and the mood, why obviously we get, you know, completely different psychological kind of effect than one would get from daylight, and a painting has to be painted compatible to these circumstances, knowing that the artificial light is going to do something that's different than, for example, the one of Christina. If I put an artificial light on Christina, it would be a different aesthetic. Therefore, since it was a different aesthetic, I'd have to build the whole painting around this different aesthetic. Same with, and so with this artificial light, I've done something, hopefully, that where everything is compatible. It's a far heavier mood, so I paint heavier pictures, psychologically penetrating kind of things.
I spoke with Renee Shanks and Pilar Cruz about how the apprentice system works in Nelson's studio.
The system here is set up, generally there's 2 students or 3 students at a time who come from anywhere for a period of 2 to 4 years. And it's kind of a work-study program. They study here and live here, and as well as work. I think this is a unique system. I think it's something that maybe nobody else in the country is doing right now. It's more of an old method of teaching. You're painting right along with Nelson daily, and by being able to do that every day, you're able to really pick up and learn a lot. As far as that goes, it's more concentrated, for example, than being in a university, say, because you're not going from class to class. You're studying with one person, and you're studying. It's more of a concentrated program.
Well, from my perspective, it's a great opportunity because I used to have to work in order to go to art school, and I don't have to right now. I mean, I work, but I consider that, you know, very little to compare to what I was doing before, and it's just an excellent opportunity, and, you know, should be done more frequently.
The same principles that Nelson teaches applies to people as well as still life, as well as whatever you're going to draw or paint.
Yeah.
It's a very solid way of learning. There's no tricks to it. It's hard work is basically what it is. The ideas are fairly simple. The basics are simple, but they're not easy. Yeah. And it's a struggle. I mean, we're here every day just pushing along and trying to, I think as days go by, each day you're more awed by Nelson's work because you're realizing really how difficult and how advanced and sophisticated it is.
It's so simple when you see it, and then when you try and do it, difficult because what you're really learning is to see. I mean, everything that we do here is all focused on learning how to see things and how to see what we're painting or how to see what we're drawing. And so it's really just a matter of that, and that's very difficult once you start doing it.
This is a student demonstration and is different than
it's only about two and a half hours.
His finished work, but basically what he's trying to teach us here is, you know, don't be afraid of the paint. Lay your paint on, you know,
so you can
thickly,
move it around.
And don't be afraid to put
canvas.
color in it. I mean, really push that color. You'll see beautiful greens in here. Colors that you would not necessarily expect to find in flesh, but are there and work. And that's part of what she was talking about in learning to see. When you're learning to see, you learn to see colors like that. They actually exist. And that takes a lot of training to see, as well as working with these very big shapes. If you notice, this is all done very simply and economically. And that's what makes it so powerful and strong. And what's the difficult thing to learn is simplicity. That's the hard part. I mean, it's easy to get very noodly and try to, you know, make something a little imperfect, but getting something to work simple.
More powerful.
In other words, like a lot of teachers will have you measuring things, for example, and marking points on your canvas or board, whereas Nelson's philosophy is more trust your eyes. You know, don't measure and get tight that way. You have to trust your eyes. And basically what you try to do is look at shapes. Like, you can forget that you're drawing a person and forget that you're drawing a still life, but you know, what size is the head compared to the shoulders, forgetting that it's a head and a shoulder.
Yeah. As a beginner student, usually, I think, you have a preconceived idea about an image, about something. Like if you're probably going to sit down for the first time and draw a head or a face or a body, you're going to draw a circle and you're going to draw something that looks, you know, it's a preconceived idea about how things look. And what he's telling you is to really look at it, and when you really look at it, it isn't that. It's more than that. It's something else than that. It's shapes, and it's light and dark. It's masses, and it's all these things, and it isn't just, you know, these preconceived idea of an almond-shaped eye and a round circle as a head. So
I think
that's what it is to learning how to see, is to get away from these preconceptions.
My time, of course, is a very confused time. I'd like to think I'm not a terribly confused painter. There are obviously decisions to be made. I like to think that the biggest changes and the biggest, most important of my work is yet to come, because, as I say, I expect to make a major change. But not in style, not in principles of painting, and probably not that much in thought processes, but rather in subject matter. I would like to feel that to a degree I can reveal myself as human in my painting.
Well, I think that initially his contribution has been to return portraiture to its serious role in the arts, and now I think he will probably work in other aspects of painting, easel painting, and we'll see him make an equal contribution outside the area of portraiture.
Artbeat has also visited the studios of these former recipients of the Art Award: Dwinelle Grant, Charles Wells, Catherine Steele Renninger, Ranulph Bai, Raymond Granville Barger, and George Nakashima. These tapes are available on loan at the Bucks County Library in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. There will be a special Artbeat edition on William A. Smith, a past recipient. This will be in the fall of 1990. We hope you've enjoyed our program. Good night. Bye.